Hello, my name is Kevin Juguilon, and this is my presentation on comparing and contrasting Avicenna and St. Thomas on creation. Um, my main thesis is that Avicenna and St. Thomas Aquinas agree on most philosophical elements of creation, except for their views on emanation. While it appears that there are some other areas of contradiction, on closer examination, the philosophers are actually closer to agreement than disagreement. Key to understanding this is what I said, the philosophical elements of creation. Now, they actually are far apart on a few other areas in theologically, but philosophically, really the only sticking point is emanation. Now, this historical context, Avicenna was one of the most influential philosophers of the 10th and 11th centuries. He is widely regarded for his work in philosophy and medicine. His influence reaches beyond the world of Arabic philosophy to great Catholic thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, again, just a little bit of historical context. Here in this extended quote by John McGuinness, he says, perhaps of more importance in the long run was Avicenna's influence on Thomas Aquinas, whose system of thought still makes up much of the philosophical theology of the Catholic Church and Christian apologetics more generally. Here it is important to note that in Thomas's earlier works, he is much more willing to reference Avicenna by name in a positive way, whereas in his more mature works, such as the Summa Theologia and the commentaries on Aristotle, he prefers to mention Avicenna by name only when he is in disagreement with him. So what it seems like early on he goes to Avicenna as an authority, says Avicenna says this, Avicenna says this, according to Avicenna. But then as Thomas gets older, he doesn't do that and really only mentions Avicenna when he disagrees with him. Now, this seems like a slight, but McGuinness makes an interesting point. He says, such a seeming turn of opinion, I believe, is not so much because as Thomas grew older, he came to reject the Avicennian elements that impressed him in his youth, but because by then he had so thoroughly incorporated those elements into his own system of thought that they genuinely became his own. So for Thomas, after he's developed his philosophies, the things that Avicenna, the way he looked at the world, there's so much in there, like his views of existence and essence and all these things. He starts looking at these things. He starts incorporating them into his own philosophy, so that they're so close to Thomism. They're just Thomism. Um, so the only places where he's going to mention him is where he disagrees. So it's really important because these two men seem to have a great affinity of thought, and so it's very interesting to examine where they might disagree. So first of all, where do they agree? They both agree. They follow Aristotle's argument for the unmoved mover. They're both Aristotelians, and Aristotle made clear in the physics and in the metaphysics that it's necessary there should be if there's motion, that there should be something that's an unmoved or moved by itself, and it says this first mover then exists of necessity. And insofar as it exists by necessity, its mode of being is good, and the sense is a first principle. So, Aristotle says that if there's motion, there has to be this first mover, this unmoved mover. And for both Avicenna and St. Thomas, God is therefore conceived as the only basis and source of existence of all things. So, if there has to be a source, and that comes right out of the Aristotelian tradition. Now, where do they agree? According to Rahim Akar, there's 4 areas where they agree. 1, God creates by will. 2, God primarily and essentially wills himself, and his volition concerning the universe is subsumed in his self-volition. 3, the universe is not the end of God's will. And 4, God does not need to create in order to be what he is. That is, God's being and goodness do not depend on the existence of other things. So let's take these apart point by point. Point 1, all it's saying is that God does not create the universe as an unconscious or involuntary act. Creation is an act of God willing it. He's an agent who wills things into existence. Now, Avicenna and St. Thomas are going to argue that creation is in some way necessary, but I'll explain that more later. Avicenna believes that in emanation, again, I'm going to get into a lot more detail about emanation later on in the video, which seems to contradict God's free will, and we saw in lecture 3 of this course is the idea that God as lone cause also manifested itself in the emanation scheme, which deprived God of free will in the act of creating. So there is this strong idea that if you are an emanationist, that God does not create by will. It's just something that flows out of him. And we're going to address the seeming contradiction because Akar is going to argue that emanation doesn't contradict God's freedom. Now, points 2 and 3, all it's saying is that God does not act for some other end. He has no final cause other than himself. If the creation of the universe were some kind of end or final cause for God, then there'd be something greater than God. God was striving for something he didn't have or he was missing. And for Arabic philosophers, God, um, the ultimate cause of all things, cannot have been caused by someone else, nor could he be more than one, for some distinguishing characteristic would make him composite, requiring an efficient cause prior to himself. The essential characteristics of a first being then must be unity, simplicity, and independence from the four causes. Now, again, the part of this sentence is talking about how God, doesn't, doesn't doesn't have a different kind of cause, an efficient cause, but that he's independent of the four causes. He also doesn't have a final cause. I mean, other than himself. And as St. Thomas says, nothing apart from God is his own end. And the fourth point is just saying that creation is not something God needs to do in order to be God. God is already complete in and of himself. He's Avicenna says that the first principle is first and perfect. And again, by perfect is from this quote from St. Thomas. He says here that perfect was that which lacks nothing of the mode of its perfection. So when we're talking about something as perfect, God lacks nothing. God doesn't need um, God doesn't need to create in order to it to be God per se. You can conceive of a God being all powerful, all good, complete without the universe. God is complete in himself. He doesn't need to create the universe, something outside of himself, in order to be God, because then he wouldn't be perfect, and because he would lack something. Now, again, where do they seem to disagree? There seems to be three main areas of disagreement: emanation, whether the universe was emanated; the universe having a beginning in time; and the necessity of the universe. But we're going to see that they, with the exception of emanation, they really seem to have more of a philosophical agreement. Emanation is the idea that is found in Arabic philosophy with Avicenna's predecessors like Al-Farabi, and it seems to be growing out of the Aristotelian tradition. It's Al-Farabi who will establish the framework through which Ibn Sina, and that's Avicenna, will bring into being the fullness of the golden age of Islam, culminating in the classical Renaissance of the Muslim world. And again, this influence of Al-Farabi, it's in Al-Farabi's presentation, Aristotle's cause of motion, which accounts for the revolution of the spheres. And again, this goes through the whole idea, this imagery of emanation. So, um, what this trying to show is that the idea of emanation it's built off of this traditional interpretation of Aristotle. Emanation didn't just come out of nowhere. And in emanation, all intelligibles were the eternal object of thought by the first principle, and then in descending hierarchical order by the intellects of the celestial spheres, emanating from the first and ending with the active intellect, the intellect of the terrestrial realm. So what you have here in emanation is you've got God. God is that first principle, and then he emanates the first intellect. From the one comes the one, and then from the first intellect, then will come the second intellect, and also other things. And then uh, from the second intellect will come other things. So they will flow out of those things that are emanated. Um, uh, Whereas it's going to be different than the way Thomas sees how creation works. Um, so Thomas is going to argue against emanation. With regard to this theory of emanation, Thomas observes that it cannot stand. Creation is strictly the work of God alone, which he cannot share with others. An instrumental causality exercised by creatures, though subordinated to God, is impossible. Everything must be willed and done by God. So God cannot outsource creation to something else. He cannot give other creatures the power to create the way he creates. St. Thomas states it sufficiently appears at first glance that to create can be the action of God alone. Now, to produce being absolutely not as this or that being belongs to creation. Hence, it is manifest that creation is the proper act of God alone. So again, God alone is the one who can create. So if you look at this diagram that I made to kind of contrast the two, so accepting the cosmology of like Aristotle and accepting the way Avicenna looks at the cosmology, let's just assume that that's how Thomas Aquinas looks at it. Whether or not that's the case, let's just assume this is how they viewed cosmology. From this diagram, which I took from the based on our week 3 lecture. We have here God, and from God emanates the first intellect. From the one comes the one. And then from the first intellect will emanate the second intellect. Now, the second intellect not only emanates the third intellect, but also the outermost heaven. And then the third intellect emanates the fourth intellect, which then also, and the third also uh, emanates the sphere of fixed stars, and then the fourth. And just for time's sake, these each should be their own fourth, fifth, sixth, but you kind of get the idea. From the fourth to fifth through the 10th, the intellects from each of the planets, the sun, the moon. So you see this great chain of creation. That's really not how Thomas would see it. So again, accepting that cosmology, that if that outermost heaven, the fixed stars and planets, sun and moon were created, um, it wouldn't be that God creates something which then creates the others. Instead, the outermost heaven is created by God. The sphere of fixed stars created by God. The planets, sun, and moon created by God, because creation is purely the act of God, and it can't be, there can't be an instrumental causality, as was said earlier. So, second part: does the universe have a temporal beginning? Um, does the universe begin in time? And many ancient philosophers did not believe that it began in time. Quote, the idea that the universe began to exist after non existence was not the way ancient philosophers preferred to explain the existence of the universe. That the universe did not have a beginning was supported by the majority of philosophers of the ancient period, including Plato and Aristotle. God and the universe, then, seem to exist alongside each other. The doctrine of the creation out of nothing, as it is understood today, may be seen as having arisen later. So, yeah, it is very common today. People just assume the universe had a beginning. The Big Bang Theory has kind of taken root in the culture, but ancients like Aristotle and Plato, they didn't necessarily think that the world began. They just thought it always was. That was Avicenna as well. His position was that the world, though caused by God, is co-eternal. So if God is eternal, so is the universe. Now, again, this is important to understand. It doesn't mean that the universe is independent. It's the relationship between God and the universe is not one of temporal priority and posteriority, but a relationship of essential or logical priority or posteriority. Now, again, in order to understand what Avicenna's point here is that cause and effect are not temporal things. Again, the some of the Enlightenment philosophers thought that cause was and effect were always cause always preceded in time effect, and there's a temporal relationship, and it's not necessarily the case. And a lot of times it is, but it doesn't have to be. Um, for example, I give an example here of cutting paper. So say, okay, it's cutting paper. What's the cause? The scissors cutting. What's the effect? The paper is being cut. But notice that's not there's no temporal difference between the two. It's not like the scissors cut and then later the paper is being cut. It's a simultaneous thing. There's no temporal difference. However, the cause is prior to the effect, not necessarily in time, but logically or essentially. And so for Avicenna, creation is an eternal process. So again, it's something that is not something which is happening in time. Now, St. Thomas, now here's the thing. This is where they seem to disagree, but we're going to clarify this. St. Thomas does make an argument for a temporal beginning to the universe. He states very clearly, nothing except God can be eternal. Fine. But here's the thing. He also makes clear this is an article of Christian faith that the universe began. And he says, but as an article of faith, it cannot be proved demonstratively, because faith is of things that appear not. Therefore, the newness of the world, meaning the creation of the world, is known only by revelation, and therefore it cannot be proved demonstratively. So it's very interesting here, because what he's saying that that the universe began. That's an article of faith. He's not making a philosophical argument that the world had a beginning. And now, however, what's interesting though is that even though he believes that, Thomas doesn't necessarily need that for his view of creation, especially if he's going along with Aristotle's unmoved mover. As Edward Fraser points out, that St. Thomas uses he sees the causality of the unmoved mover as hierarchical, not necessarily temporal. So in a hierarchical series, there's a certain sort of dependence on the later members of the earlier ones. So again, what Thomas is saying is that there is a cause and effect, clearly, between the universe and God. And as a Christian, he accepts in faith that it's a temporal, it's that there was a point at which the universe comes into being. But Thomas' argument for the unmoved mover, he says you don't need that um, coming into being. So Fraser claims the claim is not that a series has to be traced back to some beginning point in the past, as the Big Bangs say. The argument still works whether or not the universe had a temporal beginning. So again, Thomas says if you're a Christian, you accepted faith that the universe began. The unmoved mover argument works. whereas you don't need it. But even if it didn't, the unmoved mover argument still works. So what you see here, the main difference is that Avicenna argues that the universe cannot have a temporal beginning. St. Thomas accepts that the universe had a beginning as a matter of faith, but it doesn't make a philosophical argument against it. And his philosophical arguments, the unmoved mover, are open to the idea of the universe not having a beginning. Uh, Now, the last part is necessity. Now, Avicenna holds that the universe is necessary, and it appears that Aquinas differs with him here. Whereas for Avicenna, the universe is necessary. For Aquinas, God has the free will to create and the freedom to choose what to create. Here's the thing, though. This, according to Akar, his argument is that they're actually much closer than they appear. The reason why is because of a distinction that Thomas makes that Avicenna does not. So for Avicenna, this necessity is not a contradiction to his will. He says the universe is necessarily the way it is. For Avicenna, there is nothing internal requiring that God should create, though this seems difficult for Avicenna to defend, since he argues that God knows himself in such a way that the existence of things is the necessary concomitant of God's majesty, which is loved in itself. For Avicenna, God creates out of his generosity, since he neither expected nor attains anything in return. So for Avicenna, creation is an act of generosity. Again, generosity, it's a very interesting way to look at it, because for generosity is what's given. I want to say superfluously. That's not the right term. The generosity is given over in abundance. According to Akar, Avicenna's view is that although the concomitant necessarily follows from the thing of which it is concomitant, the thing that has this concomitant does not subsist through its concomitant. That is, the thing that has a concomitant does not depend on its concomitant in order to be the thing that it is. So again, the creation of the universe is a concomitant. It's something that flows out of the person by their nature, but it's not an essential to their nature. So here, if you want to look at it this way, if I'm a good person, and let's say I walk into the classroom, and the day before I had my students, I promised one of them I would give them a candy bar. Now I walk into the room, and I'm let's say if by nature of being a good person, if a good person by definition is one who keeps their promises, I will. I must give them the candy bar. That is essential to me doing that. Now, let's say I saw a student who didn't have a candy bar, and just out of generosity, I had an extra candy bar, and I gave it to them. That would not. I could, if I made good on my obligation to be let's say a good, just person. Um, I could. It would be something over and above. It would not be necessarily essential to who I to in order to be a good person. It was over and above. But it is consistent with the nature of being. I can still be a good person without being giving that extra candy bar. But because I'm a good person, I will give the extra candy bar. Thus, creation is not a constitutive element of what God is, but rather follows from it. That's what it means that he says it's a concomitant. However, the universe must be created this way. And this is, again, where we get to this interesting idea of necessity. So when Avicenna looks at the universe, he says, you cannot even consider that God could have not created, because God is necessary in all respects. And saying that God could not have created assumes a possibility which laid out ahead before God. For Avicenna, everything God does is necessary, since there is nothing superfluous in God. And God made the universe as it is, therefore the universe is necessary in this sense. It could not have been made otherwise, because God is perfect. So again, from God is perfect, and if God does nothing superfluous, then what he makes must be perfect. So this must be the way the universe must have been made. Now, this is where Thomas seems to contradict him. But he's going to make an important distinction. Now, according to Akar, this is the source of the disagreement. What Aquinas seems to argue is that God could have created things other than those he actually did, because things that exist because of God are not all of what God could create. So, the universe could have been made differently. According to Thomas, like God could have created unicorns and dragons and Pegasus and rainbow-colored scorpions. And so it's important to say, Thomas, that God freely chooses to create the universe, but it should not be seen that the universe is a limitation of what God makes. So it seems like Thomas looks at Avicenna The Avicennian point says, well, this is God makes everything uh, God is perfect, so everything He made has to be made this way. Thomas sees that as a limitation of God's power, as if you were to say, oh, say, so God could not have made rainbow-colored scorpions. No, of course He could make rainbow-colored scorpions, and to say that He couldn't seems to be a limitation on His power. So God, in His power, could have made the universe differently. The distinction Thomas makes, though, and this is the important part, there's a distinction that Avicenna doesn't, and this is how Akar tries to harmonize the two views. The distinction Thomas makes is between hypothetical necessity and absolute necessity, whereas Avicenna argues that the universe is necessary without further explanation. Aquinas gives a more detailed explanation of how the universe is necessary, and in one sense, God has free will and free choice. He argues the universe is hypothetically necessary, not absolutely, and that a God has free choice in the sense that neither the actual nor any definitive set of creatures matches the infinite perfections of God. So let's unpack what this means. So Thomas is he's gonna say yes, the universe is necessary in some sense, but no, it's not in another sense. And again, Thomas being the master of the distinction, this is really important. So the distinction explains the difference that seems to be the two. So St. Thomas states, from this we may infer, although among his effects God wills nothing with absolute necessity, yet he does will something with the necessity of a supposition. That's the hypothetical necessity. So again, the universe is not absolutely necessary. As we said before, when in the areas where they agree, part 4 of the where they agree, God could have made the universe differently. God doesn't even need to make a universe in order to be God. There's no absolute necessity for the universe to exist, but it is hypothetically necessary. Furthermore, what God He can, for His power is not decreased, as neither is His essence. But He cannot now not will what He is posited as having willed, because His will cannot be changed. Therefore, at no time could He not will what He willed. It is therefore necessary by supposition that He willed whatever He willed, and also that He wills it. Neither, however, is it absolutely necessary, but rather possible in the aforementioned way. So again, that sounds kind of confusing, but here's what he means. And I had a professor in an earlier class use this as a metaphor between the difference between the necessities. Is it absolutely necessary that I be sitting in my car right now? No, there's nothing absolutely necessary about me sitting in my car. However, so hypothetically, it is necessary for me to be sitting in my car if I'm driving my car. If I'm driving my car, it is necessary that I be sitting in my car in order to drive my car. And that's kind of what Thomas is making here. He's saying it's not. It's absolutely necessary, but that the universe, is created, yeah, then it would be it's necessary that God doesn't will anything other than He will, because he's unchanging. So St. Thomas considers God's attributes distinctly, whereas Avicenna considers them in unity. So Thomas, looks at the distinctions. He's looking at these aspects of God in different distinctions, whereas Avicenna puts them all together. Thus, if God's will is considered in isolation from His immutability and eternity, things are not necessary. And again, so so Thomas kind of separates God's immutability from all those other areas, and so he says, okay, it is unity. He's like, okay, well, if you look at God's will apart from that, then no, the universe is not absolutely necessary. But if it's considered together with God's immutability and eternity, one may extend the list under the title God's formal features, and the fact that He wills existence of other things, and the universe is necessary. This kind of necessity is a hypothetical necessity. Hence, the universe is hypothetically necessary. So Avicenna says, okay, but again, God wills and God is unchanging, so this could never change. This is the way it should be. So whereas Thomas kind of distinguishes and separates them out, that's why he makes the distinction between absolute necessity and hypothetical necessity. So St. Thomas considers God's will in distinction from God's immutability and in other things like His eternity and things like that. And in that context, the universe is not absolutely necessary. But if His will is seen as it unified with His other divine attributes, like His immutability and His eternity, then in that context, the universe is hypothetically necessary. So, conclusion. Avicenna and St. Thomas agree that God willed the world into being, and He did so freely. And really for no other reason other than Himself. They disagree about emanation. That is the key. They are far apart on that. Avicenna accepts the emanationist scheme from the Al-Farabi tradition, which, again, they saw as an outgrowth of Aristotle. St. Thomas rejects emanation, stating that God alone can create, not using intermediaries. They disagree about the universe having a temporal beginning. Avicenna believes that the universe is co-eternal with God, whereas Thomas believes the universe is brought into being. Um, though his argument from first cause does not require a temporal beginning, and St. Thomas states that a temporal beginning is an article of faith. So again, the difference is theological, religious difference. It's not a philosophical difference. And again, as we said, his argument for first cause doesn't require his philosophy of the first cause does not require a temporal beginning. They appear to disagree about the universe being necessary, but if you accept Akar's argument, then Avicenna only believes the universe is necessary in the hypothetical sense. And if that is the case, then he is in agreement with St. Thomas.